Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Forum at St. Bart's. My name is Peter Thompson. I'm the Associate Rector for Formation and Liturgy here, and it is my delight to welcome you to this conversation with the Reverend Molly James, PhD. Molly is the Deputy Executive Officer of the General Convention of the Episcopal Church. She's a theologian and a priest and professor, and she is also the author of With Joyful Acceptance Maybe, Reflections on Suffering and Grief, and she's going to share some of the work that went into that book, which was also her doctoral dissertation. Thank you so much for being with us today, Molly.
It's a privilege to be with you all. Thank you. I'm very glad to be here. As Peter mentioned, I work in the General Convention office, and in a different world, I would have just walked over to be with you all on a Wednesday evening. I'm grateful for the technology that allows me to join with you today. Wanted to just offer a little bit about who I am and sort of how I got here and what I bring to this. So as Peter mentioned, I'm a priest in the Diocese of Connecticut. I've had the privilege of knowing Peter for a number of years as he served in Connecticut. I'm also a wife and a mom. I love to cook, I love to travel and read, and I wake up really early in the morning to go do CrossFit, or to do CrossFit in my own house, as I've been doing for the past few months, like all of us at home. So this morning, I would like to share with you some theological tools for how we might think about the realities of grief and suffering in our lives. This, as Peter mentioned, is work that comes out of my own theological studies, but for me, this is not merely an intellectual exercise. I'm a cancer survivor. I had bone cancer when I was a teenager, so I have been asking questions about life and death and making meaning in the midst of suffering since I was in middle school. So I'm going to talk with you this morning about 5 thinkers who almost span the history of the church. Gregory the Great, so beginning in the 6th century Pope, and Julian of Norwich, who's a 13th century English mystic, Jeremy Taylor, a 17th century Anglican bishop in the Church of England, and C.S. Lewis, who is probably the most familiar name on that list, and then Ivone Gebara, who's a contemporary feminist theologian from Brazil. So we're going to walk through each of these thinkers and how they might help us to think about suffering and grief in our own experiences. So Gregory the Great, we'll begin chronologically. 6th century Pope who sees suffering as an opportunity for spiritual growth. He is most notable for a book, a manual he wrote for his clergy on how to provide proper pastoral care and to people in the midst of their suffering. He also wrote a notable commentary on the book of Job. Then Julian of Norwich, Norwich in England. She's a mystic, an anchorite, someone who lived in a little cell, as it were, attached to a church. She had a window to the world and a window where she could watch Mass celebrated. And she was sought out as a spiritual counselor of the day. So people would come to her window to the world to seek her advice and wisdom about things spiritual. Notable, very notable for the fact that she could read and write and was really a theologian in her own right in that time, a rare thing for a woman to do that. And notable that she wrote in Middle English, think Chaucer and Canterbury Tales kind of English, rather than, she didn't write in Latin like so many other scholars of the day. And her book, The Revelations of Divine Love, is one that comes out of her own experiences and is most notable for our conversation today, is a parable in it called The Parable of the Lord and the Servant, and we'll touch a bit more on that in a moment. Then the third thinker we will talk through is Jeremy Taylor, who wrote a spiritual manual called Holy Living and Holy Dying. He sought to give people spiritual tools for how they might live with the reality of death. Jeremy Taylor was a bishop during the English Civil War. There were plagues at that time, and he certainly suffered losses in his own personal life. Not all of his children survived him. So he's someone who knew well from his own context the realities of suffering and death. And then we have C.S. Lewis, who is probably best known for his Chronicles of Narnia, the children's book, or series of books. And those have some excellent theology in them as well. Although I think that in terms of living with the realities of suffering and grief, his own journal, which was published under the title A Grief Observed, which is the journal he wrote in the wake of his wife's death, is probably the best tool because it is so honest and frank in its emotions and in its thinking, and he really offers us a model for how to grieve. And then lastly, we have Ivone Gebara, Roman Catholic sister, feminist liberation theologian from Brazil, who writes out of her own experience of life on the margins as a woman in Latin America, in South America. And she's someone who really questions the source of suffering. So it might make sense if we were doing a sort of historical survey to begin chronologically, as I just did in outlining the lives of each of those briefly. And you could really make a case for beginning with any of these thinkers. But I think for us, actually, it's most important that we begin with Ivone Gebara as the starting place for this conversation about grief and suffering, because she asks the very important question that we need to start with. So Ivone Gebara is someone who lives, she's still alive, in among the poor people in Brazil. And she wrote a lot out of her own experience as a woman who had lived under dictatorship, as someone who had been really marginalized in her own life as a sister in the Roman Catholic Church, and who really was formed by the realities of liberation theology, which of course tells us that Jesus identifies with those who are on the margins. And she saw and experienced in her own life the suffering of life of those who were marginalized in society or marginalized by the church in some way. And she was very critical of the ways that the church especially had been complicit in causing suffering, in that sort of, giving the message that said, well, we all have our cross to bear, so you women and poor people especially should just accept your challenges, accept your suffering joyfully because we all have our crosses to bear. But she felt that the church had been really complicit in keeping people marginalized, and sort of using theology to be complicit or even to endorse the reality of suffering of those on the margins. And she said, no, that's not how this is supposed to be. If Jesus is on the side of those on the margins, then we have to ask about the source of suffering. So Gebara is really significant because she asks the essential question. She says, is the suffering that someone has experienced endemic? Is it the kind of suffering that we should expect because we have mortal bodies and this is a world that has natural disasters and we can experience illness and death and we know that we will eventually die. And so there is a certain amount of suffering in life that is just endemic that we should expect to be a part of life. Then there is other suffering that is preventable suffering, and that's the suffering that's the result of injustice. And she says you have to differentiate those two things. Right? We have to talk. We should talk differently about suffering that's endemic versus suffering that is the result of injustice. And I think that is an important reminder for us as Christians, and it is especially an important reminder for us as the church in this time. We have been reminded in recent weeks, right, of the disproportionate ways in which COVID-19 has affected people of color. The deaths of George Floyd, of Breonna Taylor, of so many others have reminded us of the legacy and the reality of systemic racism in our country. So we have been reminded very strongly in recent weeks of the reality of suffering that is the result of injustice. And Gebara reminds us that suffering, we are called to do something about. We as Christians are called to fight that suffering. We're called to prevent that suffering. We're called to stop it. That is our call as Christians, is to stop suffering that is a result of injustice, because we are called to be promoters of justice and of helping to make God's dream for humanity a reality. So we need to start with Gebara because we need to make that very important distinction. So if the suffering is a result of injustice, then we are called to be a part of the solution, a part of stopping it, and ideally a part of preventing it from happening in the first place. So then if we take that other side and we turn to the suffering that is endemic, the suffering that we can just expect to be true as a part of our human existence, then we go back to the other thinkers, to Julian and Taylor and Lewis and Gregory, as providing us tools. And so that's where I'm going to focus today. I want to make that very important distinction that the tools we are talking about are the tools for living with endemic suffering, and unjust suffering is meant to be stopped. So now with that distinction, we go back to Julian, and we can draw on her approach of joyful acceptance as suffering. So as I mentioned, Julian lived in the 14th century in England. She lived also through a time of plague, and certainly knew the reality of illness. Her own visions that were written down as the revelations of divine love came to her in the context of her own illness. They thought that she was going to die, the priest was called, and she had quite a series of visions that she then spent decades really analyzing in her own mind and writing down and exploring the theological implications of those. She wrote both a short text, so sort of initially wrote down reflections on those, and then a much longer text that sort of offers a much fuller explication of her visions. And there's some really beautiful imagery and theology. Some of the canticles we use in enriching our worship come from her writings. So she is perhaps all best known in the world for her phrase, "all will be well." She's often quoted for that. Now, if you take that quote all by itself, it sounds sort of Pollyanna-ish, as though you're just thinking, oh, everything's going to be fine, and you're not actually paying attention to the reality of what's going on in the world. But that's only true if you take her quote out of the context. She absolutely understood personally and professionally and in what she saw in the world the realities of suffering and grief. So actually, that statement of hers is far more profound than it might sound, because it is a deep conviction that all will be well, even in the face of remarkable suffering and challenges. So it is a conviction that God is with us in our suffering, and that we are being brought to something far greater beyond, once we are beyond our suffering. And the emblematic story in her writing that provides that image is the parable of the Lord and his servant. So she tells a story of a vision of a Lord who is very anxious to do, Lord who has a servant, who's the servant is very anxious to do the Lord's bidding, to do what he's been asked to do, called to do. And he hurries off to do what he's been asked to do. And he's hurrying, and he's not really paying attention to where he's going. He falls in a ditch. And then he's stuck. He's stuck in the ditch, and he can't get himself out. And he's, suffering, and he can't see out, and wondering. And she talks about this parable as that servant being both Adam, as in representative of all of humanity, and then also as Christ. And that servant is Christ is very important, because that's the reminder for us that God intimately knows the reality of human suffering. God knows our own experiences of human suffering. And in that story, the Lord can see the servant suffering, and eventually the Lord brings the servant out to a greater reward for how, even though he suffered. So she portrays God as a divine parent, as it were, who allows the servant to fall, but then ultimately rewards the servant on the other side of the suffering. And goes to great lengths to emphasize the fact that the Lord is there with the person, with the servant in the midst of the suffering. The Lord can see it. The Lord brings the servant to good, even at the end. So she puts the emphasis on an earthly reward, and ultimately on a heavenly reward, much like the rest of the writings of that time. So she's someone who actually belongs to the sort of theological tradition that's known as Felix Culpa, or the happy fall, which says that the fall in the Garden of Eden is ultimately a happy thing, a good thing, because where humanity gets to as a result of that is better than life was before the fall. So that ultimately where we get to, the reward of salvation is better than the life we had before the fall. Now, Julian's sort of rosy picture of, see, we all get to a good place, so it's all good, can be a little much. It can be a little too rosy a picture. And so that's why it's useful to bring in Lewis, because Julian seems to just blindly accept suffering and say, well, it's all good because we get a great reward at the end. Lewis, on the other hand, is a bit more honest and frank. If you have read A Grief Observed, then you know how full of emotion it is. He's a bit like the Psalms in his writing, in that writing particularly. At one point he refers to God as a cosmic sadist. he's pretty mad at God. And he thinks, how could God possibly have thought this was okay? How did God let this happen? Was God just trying to test my faith or punish me or something? If you know a bit of Lewis's life story, he didn't marry until very late in life. He had a few brief years of wonderful happiness with his wife, Joy, and then she was diagnosed with cancer and died pretty quickly. And his journal that he wrote in those weeks is just that. It's his journal. It's his expression of his raw emotion in the midst of intense grief. And it wasn't meant to be published initially. He showed it to a friend later, and the friend said, I think this would help a lot of people. And so Lewis agreed to have it published. It was initially published under a pseudonym and was never attributed to him until after his own death. And he, like the Psalms, he begins in that place of anger and grief and frustration and all of the sort of fullness of emotion that we can feel in the midst of grief. And so that's the real gift that Lewis brings as a sort of counterbalance to Julian, is allowing us to experience the fullness of emotion that we do experience in our own times of grief. The thing is, so Lewis gives us permission to be angry. The thing that Lewis models for us is that we don't stay angry. Ultimately, at the end even of his journal, which was written over a period of weeks, he comes to a place of peace. It isn't peace in that he's solved the intellectual problem of pain, which he sought to do in another book much earlier in his career. He stopped thinking of it as an intellectual problem to solve. He realizes that it's just a truth to be lived with, and comes to a place of realizing that God is with him in the pain, not causing it or somehow, some kind of sadistic figure that he initially imagined. That he very much feels God's presence as a source of comfort. He realizes he doesn't fully understand it, and it's just something he's going to have to live with. So Lewis is a gift because he gives us permission to feel the fullness of emotions, and he invites us to think about what we do with those emotions and how we might find them to be a force for transformation. And that's how we can get to Gregory. Gregory is a very good tool for thinking about how grief might be transformative. Gregory referred to grief as the great teacher. He thought suffering. Now, Gregory is slightly problematic, of course, because he thought suffering was such a good thing because we learn so much from it that therefore we should have more of it. He was very ascetical in his own life practices. He did all kinds of self-deprivation practices such that he basically wreaked such havoc on his own digestive system that he was largely ill for the entirety of his life. So I don't suggest following him in his model on that front. He's not helpful. And I don't think there's enough suffering that just comes in life. We don't need to seek it out. Just because suffering can be a good teacher doesn't mean we need to find more of it. I think all of us would say plenty of it comes our way in life. And so we don't need to seek it out. So if we put that caveat on Gregory, that we don't necessarily need to follow his personal model, but we can learn from his insight of the idea that grief can be our teacher. So that in the midst of experiences of suffering and grief, we have the opportunity to learn, to grow, to be spiritually cleansed. And I think this is something some of us may be able to attest to from our own experiences, about the ways in which the pain and the challenge of experiences of grief and suffering can focus our vision and help us have clarity about what is really important in life. And that the experience of suffering brings us closer to God and closer to each other. And therefore we can grow emotionally and spiritually in our own relationships in the midst of suffering. Another point on which Gregory is in fact quite helpful is in his commentary on the book of Job. Now, if you know the story of Job, his friends come to visit him early on in his sufferings, And they are full of reasons why he is suffering, and all kinds of accusatory statements about what Job must have done wrong to possibly deserve all of this. They're exactly what you don't want someone to do when you are suffering. Can you imagine if someone came to visit you in your hospital room and was just lecturing you about everything they thought you'd ever done wrong, and clearly that was why you were just going to come here and heap on your pain and suffering? Not helpful. And we give Gregory great credit, because Gregory read the book of Job and said, that's not helpful, don't do that, basically to his followers, who said that's not how you should go and be with someone in suffering. You don't go and berate them for their sins. So that's another good piece from Gregory. And then again, for more tools for us on how we might cope in the midst of suffering, Jeremy Taylor is a great resource. Like Gregory, he's someone who valued suffering for the spiritual fruits it could bring, for what you could learn from it and how it might lead you to a more faithful, pious life. As I mentioned, Gregory Taylor was a bishop in the Church of England, lived through Civil War, lost a number of his own children, so he personally knew the experiences of suffering quite well. And so he wrote not just as a theologian in the time, but as someone who personally knew the reality of suffering. He held very strong to a conviction that we cannot be overwhelmed in the midst of our suffering, and that we are to trust in God and to practice patient forbearance. Now, patient forbearance is something that has a long legacy in the Christian tradition, particularly if you're familiar with New England Puritanism, for instance, and which, of course, can get down the road of, therefore, suffering is good for us. And this is, again, why we have to start with Gebara, because if we started with Taylor, and Gregory, we'd be just saying all suffering is good, therefore we should have more of it because it'll make us more spiritual people. No, we need to make those distinctions, and we don't need to be seeking out suffering. Plenty of it will come our way. And when it does, then we can turn to Taylor and look at how we might live with it. So we are meant to have patience, forbearance in the midst of that suffering that is endemic. We don't ever need to be patiently forbearing injustice. That's not what we are called to do. Now, Taylor is notable because he spends a lot of his writings, in fact, he ends a funeral sermon, with a statement that you should go home and think about death. Now, on the surface, that might seem a morbid suggestion. You think, why would you want to do that? We just had a funeral. Do we really need more thoughts about death? But his goal he wasn't asking people to be morbid. He wasn't saying, oh, well, you should just go and sort of be depressed about the reality of death. No, he wanted people to go and be aware of death such that they might live differently. It's an opportunity to recognize the preciousness, the fragility of life, and to use that reality of death as a motivation for living our lives differently, living our lives more faithfully, more connected to God, more in line with our values, with what God calls us to do. And I would imagine that is an experience that is, in fact, borne out in your own experiences as well. If you have ever had a serious illness, a brush with death, if you have lost someone close to you, the reality of death, the reality of our own mortality, can make us wake up and pay attention and realize there are no guarantees about how long any of us have. Life is precious and fragile, and we ought to think carefully about how we use it and how we live well in whatever time we are granted. And maybe even the realities of the last few months and the nature of the pandemic and the realities that we have all witnessed in the world might also have prompted some of those. And if so, I hope we'll have some conversation about that in a few minutes. So ultimately, if we sort of bring all of these folks together, we have a place that we start with Gebara's very important question that says, is the suffering we are experiencing or we are witnessing the result of injustice? Then we are called to do something about it. If it is endemic, it is the kind of suffering that we can reasonably expect in the course of our human existence, then we can figure out how to move towards acceptance. And if we're to move towards acceptance, then we have much to learn from our ancestors in the faith about how we live with suffering. And of course, we have to keep Lewis in there as permission to feel the fullness of human emotion in the midst of how we might live with the realities of suffering that we experience. And before we move to a time of discussion questions, I just want to offer some practical tools which Peter will send out to you all. One is a bibliography of books, and if you would like to read more or think more about this topic, is a bibliography I've put together on this topic. And then the other is a conversation sort of starter and some links about thinking about realities of illness and death and dying. Taylor asked us to go and think about death so that we might live differently. And there's some practical tools there for how you might do that. If you don't already have an advance directive, for instance, if you haven't had conversations with those around you who would make decisions for you at the end of your own life, I would strongly encourage you to do so. That can be a clarifying experience about what really matters to you. Those can be deep and holy conversations. And so there are some tools there for how you might have those conversations. Peter can also send you this whole presentation, and my email is there, and I'm certainly glad to be a resource to any of you as you might need to have those important conversations with those you love. So I would be glad to have conversation or back and forth with any questions you all might have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Molly, for that really comprehensive look at these issues of suffering and grief. Those of you who have questions, I encourage you to send them in. You can use the live chat function on YouTube. You can use the comments function on Facebook, or you can email them to me, pthompson@stbarts.org. Molly, I wonder, you did this research several years ago. We've referenced the past few months a little bit, and I'm wondering if you can talk about anything that the pandemic of COVID-19 or the pandemic of systemic racism about which we've had a kind of more sustained and deserved reckoning in the past few weeks and months. How have these months changed your thinking about suffering, if at all? Or were you fully prepared for all the issues that came up in the past few months?
I don't think any of us were fully prepared for the realities of the past few months. I think one of the pieces that this experience has highlighted for me is that the ways in which they can be inextricably linked, right? I set Gebara up as an opportunity to sort of make a distinction between unjust suffering and endemic suffering. But what we've realized in the past few weeks is the ways in which those two things can happen sort of simultaneously, or what might be endemic suffering for some of us is actually unjust suffering for others. So I don't think we could label COVID-19 as just, well, an endemic experience of suffering, because, well, it's a disease and those happen in life, right? They just do. Well, yes, and that has not been a monolithic, uniform experience for everyone. And that within that experience of endemic suffering, which, a pandemic is we could argue is an endemic experience because it's a disease. On the other hand, we have resources in which we should have addressed, we collectively as the humanity should have addressed it differently. We could do things to prevent it. And the statistics about the ways in which it is disproportionately affecting particular populations, particularly people of color, highlights for us that there is injustice within an endemic experience, and that injustice needs to be addressed. For those of us who don't fit in those categories, should we experience illness, then there are tools here, but we do absolutely have to start with the reality of saying no to the injustice and striving to be a part of the solution as Christians.
I loved the example you used of Jeremy Taylor, because I just think holy dying is such a beautiful meditation And I love that prayer that is in those kind of extra funeral prayers about the shortness and uncertainty of human life, because it's just so true. But many people aren't familiar with Taylor, even though he's kind of a rich example of our Anglican tradition. I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about his contribution to this dialogue.
Sure. So he wrote a very long, it's a very long manual, and it's a really thick book. So part of, I think, why he gets sort of lost is it's this, it isn't a brief little piece to read. He was writing at a time when spiritual manuals were proper, and people had time to sit and read a really long book about how to be a Christian. And how to be a faithful follower. So I think he's worth going back to, because you can just pull pieces from his work and focus on his own sort of model of how he lived, which was really to make the reality of death a part of your spiritual practices. And that's not hard to do for us as Christians, right? It shows up regularly in our scriptures. It shows up in our Psalms. It shows up in the course of our church year. We acknowledge the reality of death on a regular basis. It is a part of our Eucharistic celebration, even if we haven't all been able to participate in that fully in the ways that we would like. So I invite all of us on Taylor's inspiration to be attentive to the ways in which the truth of our mortal death shows up in our faith lives on a regular basis. I think oftentimes we sort of tune it out because that's scary. And it is scary. It's a scary thing to think about. And there's an invitation, if we can lay the fear aside for a moment, to allow that to inform our lives in a way that is tremendously rich. That's certainly been true in my own experience, that when I can lay the fear aside and take the gift and the lessons from the awareness of my own mortality, I pay a little bit more attention to the fullness of the current moment. I am more grateful for all the blessings that I have. I treasure the things that I have in life a little more fully, because I know there's no guarantee that I'm going to be here forever, and there's no guarantee that those I love will be here forever. And so it does help us have a sort of clarity of intention and a clarity of presence in our lives in a way that's really valuable.
I'm wondering if you can talk a little more about how you chose the 5 thinkers you chose to focus on. I know in your book, you do a kind of overview of other thinkers on suffering and grief. You talk about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, you talk about Augustine, you talk about Hauerwas and Kierkegaard. So there are other thinkers you could have focused on. Why these 5? Why would you recommend that we turn to these 5 over others?
Sure. Particularly, I think part of it was wanting to have something that sort of spanned the breadth of our tradition. So wanting to sort of space it out over the history of the church, to say this perspective isn't unique to one time period. And because each of them are folks who write theologically out of personal experiences of suffering. And that mix was really important for me, that I'm someone who writes theologically out of my own personal experiences of suffering. And I am someone who's always been interested in the ways in which our experience informs our theology and vice versa, and that dialogue. So these were 5 thinkers who allowed me to really delve into that dialogue between the intellectual and the experiential. And it was, and sort of a piece of it is just, I really like them, right? So the thing about writing a dissertation is you have to really like the people you write about, because you're going to live with them for years. And so part of it was just there was something in each of them that just resonated for me, and that together they brought out something, a piece I thought was missing in our Christian tradition, was that the sort of combination of their thinking. That obviously they're each notable in their own right, and they each bring a rich perspective. And my hope was to bring them together, because I thought they added something more sort of in conversation with each other in a way that hadn't previously been brought forth in our tradition.
So I do encourage those of you who are watching, if you have questions, to send them in using, again, the live chat function on YouTube, comments function on Facebook, or to my email, pthompson@stbarts.org, pthompson@stbarts.org. Molly, I know that you're a parent, and I'm wondering what you teach your own kids about suffering and what you recommend other folks teach their kids about suffering, knowing that you're bringing up these beings into the world and they're going to experience suffering and grief like everyone else. How do you prepare them for that?
Well, part of preparing for them for that is, from my choice has been not to hide it from them. So my children have already been to a number of funerals. They've been to funerals since they were infants. Part of that is the life of a priest, and part of that was that they, I was blessed to have two grandparents who lived to see their great grandchildren, but have since died. And so part of it was wanting to be sure that they understood from the beginning of their lives that there is a certain amount of suffering that is to be expected in life, and they have to live with it. So wanting them to just experience that and to know the suffering that experience. That being said, we don't watch television news in our house, and I don't let them get the news that way. I think the visuals on television news of late would be a bit much. Our children are 6 and 9, so that would be a lot to explain some of the things recently. But we do talk about the news. We talk about the headlines. Our daughter, who's just finished 4th grade, certainly engages with current events in her own schooling. So that's something to talk about. And we've certainly had a lot of conversations, especially in recent months, about the realities of injustice in the world and what is our role. How do we be a part of, particularly as white people, how do we be a part of helping to be a part of the solution, and what can we do differently? And I have to say, I'm also inspired by my kids and the conversations that are clearly already happening in their school system and among their friends are really good, and with an awareness of, they have a very strong sense of what is right and wrong in the world, and they see things and they say, no, that's not how it's supposed to be. And so that gives me great hope for the future, that they recognize what's wrong in the world, and that they want to be a part of doing good, a part of changing it. And it will be an ongoing journey, but my hope for them is that they have the tools to deal with the realities of suffering as they come. And I think one of the ways to do that is obviously not to overwhelm them with it. There will be plenty of suffering in their lives, but for them to slowly learn along the way that it's going to come, and we can't always do something about it, but we do have a choice about how we live with it.
I don't know about you, but one of the questions I often get as a parish priest relates to theodicy. And I know that at the beginning of your book, you kind of bracket out any questions about theodicy, but how does a good God allow suffering to happen? Why is God kind of allowing injustice and pain to occur in our world? And I wonder, I know you didn't want to focus on those questions, and I guess first, why? I think I know why you wanted to bracket those questions, but wonder if you have any reflections on theodicy, especially at the beginning of this pandemic. There were a lot of questions about, how is God allowing this to occur? If God really loves us, if God is really benevolent and good, why is this all happening?
Yes. Well, there isn't a neat and tidy intellectual solution to that problem. Lots of people have tried to make neat and tidy, and as I said, out of my own experience, the burning question for me has not been so much why something happened, but how do I live with it? I could spend a lot of time asking the question about why did I get diagnosed with cancer when I was 13, but that isn't going to change the reality that it did happen. And so the burning present question for me in that context was, how do I live with it? And so that's some of what I've wanted to focus on in my own research was, well, even if I could answer the question why, it doesn't change the reality of what I'm experiencing. And so the important piece for me was to focus on how do we live with what happens. In terms of, like you said, the questions that we could all be asking at the beginning of the pandemic. Well, obviously, if you go down the intellectual road of a God who would intervene, then God is starting to intervene in everything, and then our free will is gone. If God could fix all the things every moment of our day, then we have no agency, we have no choice. And our tradition seems to be pretty clear on humanity having free will and agency and choice in our lives. Now, I think one of the very important lessons for us in the midst of this pandemic is to realize how much human sin contributed to the horrors of it, right? That the realities of systemic racism, the realities of putting individual rights over the common good, the realities of unjust distribution of resources, all of those pieces, the fact that, that we have experts who were trying to plan for this and were not fully equipped to do so at a national or global level. The choices that have been made about how we spend our resources made this pandemic a lot worse than it could have been, I think. So I think while it would be tempting to say, well, God should have just come in and fixed it, there's also something to be said, well, you, humanity, made a mess. Right. The sum of it is, endemic, and we could certainly wish that God created a world in which there were no pandemics, no disease, no suffering, none of that. And there's a lot of evidence that would say we, humanity, have some responsibility to pay in making it worse. So I think the problem is always more complicated than just saying, well, oops, could God just come and fix this? This discrete thing, but oh wait, not this over there because I want to have a choice about that. It doesn't. I'm not sure the world works like that.
Do you think it's fair to say that we want to ask God, how could you allow this to happen, as a way of evading our own personal communal responsibility? Is that what you're suggesting?
I think sometimes that we want to put the blame on God because then we don't have to fix it. Because if God could fix it, then we don't have to do the hard work of fixing it. And I think what we've realized collectively as a society, as a church in recent weeks especially, is that there are some pretty big problems out there that we all have collective responsibility in fixing. And that those of us who are white, those of us who are in positions of power and privilege have even more responsibility to fix, because we have been the primary beneficiaries of this system as it was and is.
And finally, you've spoken a little bit about your own background, at age 13, having been diagnosed with bone cancer, I'm sure was this huge blow. Can you talk about a little bit about your own personal experiences? And I know this is primarily an intellectual exploration, but how your own personal experiences have shaped your thinking.
Sure. Absolutely. It is an intellectual exercise, but for me, that's never divorced or separated from the realities of my own life experience. And certainly a big reason of why did I choose to spend years thinking about and researching this topic and this area. So I was diagnosed in the spring of my 7th grade year with bone cancer in my collarbone. I had a year of chemotherapy and surgery. Blessedly, I'm considered cured. I'm now, 20 plus years off treatment, and all has been well in the years since then. I will say that experience, as I referenced, brought me face to face with my mortality at the age of 13, which is not an age. Usually, most teenagers are pushing the envelope and to see how far can they go and are pretty sure they're invincible. Well, that made it hard for me to relate to my peers at the time, because I was quite clear that I was not invincible. So that was a source of tension, probably till about college, when they'd got enough life experience to realize they weren't invincible. And I'd gotten a little bit of distance and could sort of not be in that place of aware of my mortality at every moment of life. although I will say carrying that knowledge of my own mortality with me has ultimately been a gift and a blessing. It makes me pay attention. It makes me be grateful. On some days, carrying it with me is a source of fear. And most days, blessedly, it's been a source of joy and gratitude, and an invitation to really live life to the fullest and to be appreciative of all that I have.
Sure. So I'm going to try to fit one more question in really quickly.
Sure.
So someone asks about materialism and individualism. Not a small question at all, but how these aspects of Western culture can contribute to denying death, this idea that we can constantly grow, without abandon,
Yes. Sure. Well, so I started my ordained ministry as a hospital chaplain, and then went on to do my PhD. And one of the pieces, in addition to my own life experience, that made me want to study more was my experience as a hospital chaplain, and consistently encountering patients and family who were very surprised to be there. And I realized how strong the messages are in our Western culture that says, if you just do this exercise for 10 minutes a week, or you eat this diet, or you take this pill, do this, you can expect a life free from suffering, right? You can just have, or you just have enough stuff. If you just buy more things, you will be happy and your life will be free from suffering. That we have been sold a false message, because that is not the source of, obviously, stuff is not the source of our happiness. Now, having our basic needs met is definitely a contribution to helping us have, full and whole lives. But having enough and having everything, those are two very different things. So I think it is very important for us to to come to grips with the fact that there will be suffering, that we can't buy our way out of that, and that to have an awareness of the fragility of life does mean acknowledging that there can't always be enough, and we can't always fix it all as much as we might like to. So I do think, our ancestors in the faith offer us a counter narrative to that narrative that says, there's a way out, or that we could possibly expect a life free from suffering. I think the sort of materialism narrative would say we could have a life without suffering, but all of our thinkers would say, no, that is not possible. And so that's an important truth to come to grips with. And when we do, talking certainly about endemic suffering, not injustice, we don't need to come to grips with injustice. We need to do something about it. But then our ancestors in the faith offer us a different narrative that is really a spiritually rich one, to counter that materialism narrative.
Well, Molly, thank you so much for joining us virtually this morning. We look forward to when this is all over, whenever this is all over, to welcoming you back to St. Bart's in person. Thank you so much for this educational, timely presentation, which will always be timely because there will always be some form of suffering and grief. So thank you so much for your contribution to our life this morning. It's been great to have you with us.
You're welcome. It's been a privilege to be with you all, and I will look forward to a time when we can all be together in person someday.